Alright, so I've played about 2 hours of the closed beta stress test of Relic Hunter's Legend, and I wanted to give my quick thoughts because this game has a lot of potential, and the first thing that I noticed was that it had heavy Borderlands influences, but this time around it's a top-down looter shooter instead of a first-person looter shooter. Right off the bat, you're going to go through the story tutorial most likely, and this was the weakest point for me in my whole playthrough. Not the actual tutorial, but the story itself. I find lighthearted stuff like this a chore to get through rather than something I'm interested in. It was like Happy Tree Friends, but without the gore, and I ended up skipping a lot of the dialogue just because I didn't care about it. I suppose it's hard to get narrative and emotion across with minimal voice acting and visuals like this, but I don't really play games for the story, so that's all I'll talk about the story. Plus, it's entirely subjective, so you might enjoy it. But what was the actual gameplay like? Well, this was the highlight for me, and I can definitely see myself grinding out hundreds of hours of playtime when the game finally releases, and to feel like that within the first couple of hours of playtime is a huge positive. The gameplay revolves around a set of planets that you'll travel to, completing different main and side missions while also grinding out missions and locations for XP, gear, currency, and levels. This is already a solid foundation, especially for a co-op game as well. Being able to grind the game out with friends will create not only a fun experience, but also healthy competition between friends because of the gear score system. I've said this before, but how many times have you stayed up later than a friend because you wanted to outlevel them or become stronger than them? I think this game will create that desire, albeit maybe on a weaker scale than a more expansive MMO. To stay on the element of grind for a bit, it's something that I think you'll need to do, not necessarily because the enemies become harder, but because the game has a gear score requirement for certain missions. I'm totally okay with an element of grind. I love grinding shit out and seeing my rewards for the effort I put in, but I understand some people might not be fond of it. But I think it should be fine because there were different objectives for each location that I went to, like protect the drill or move the payload, and it felt good to be given different objectives instead of just kill the enemies. Speaking of killing enemies, how does it feel? Well, gunplay in this game is pretty solid. Usually when I play a top-down shooter, the gunplay is really hard to fuck up, and luckily they didn't fuck it up here. It feels snappy, rewarding, and it's satisfying to watch the health bar on enemies go down. In fact, combat in general feels like a nice mix of purposeful and skillful movement and brainless spray and pray, which I like quite a lot. I did verse some harder, more tanky bosses, and my movements were almost all purposeful decisions, which I'm a big fan of because any game that also requires skill to get the best gear and progress is a game that I'm a fan of. You also use a variety of abilities in combat, and the ones I used felt pretty good and pretty useful, so I'm excited to try out all the different ults and abilities on all the other characters on full release. Progression seems to be a huge part of this game, so let me try and run through the elements of progression I've noticed so far. You have a full gear system with slots for multiple weapon types and multiple pieces of gear and accessories, all of which add to your gear score. Gear will drop on the ground from enemies, but the good shit comes from chests and bosses. You'll not only be dropped better gear to equip, but also resources that are used to enhance your gear. You can enhance your gear with those resources, but you can also merge or mod gear, but I didn't get far enough to try that element out. The gear you get dropped has different tiers and different attributes, and some of the attributes even needed to be unlocked by completing a certain objective. And that's an inclusion that I really like. Imagine getting a best in slot item and then having to complete the quest on the piece of gear to unlock its full potential. That's pretty good if you ask me. Obviously, you have a main level, and leveling up rewards skill points that can be used in the skill tree, of which there are 3. You can also get attribute points, and putting the first few skill points into any tree will reward you with your abilities. Something akin to Borderlands Badass rank, you also have the Rebel rank, which is an account-wide progression system that rewards you with different unlocks the more you play. This is an element I really like and provides incentive for replayability across the board. And you'll also get stat increases based off your gear score, so going from gear score 0 to 80 gives you increases, and then so on and so forth. So there's a reason to increase your gear score beyond just flexing it to your friends. I know that there are more elements of replayability. Also, it's important to note that the replayability isn't just tied to numbers going up and tiers going up. There's the grind, as I mentioned, and maybe later on you'll be able to do things like raid bosses or super hard dungeons together to min-max gear, and of course that all plays into replayability. All in all, I like the art style and the whole feel of Relic Hunters. I think it's got potential, and I can't wait for full release, and hopefully I can convince some of my mates to play with me. But yeah, I just thought I'd shed some light on a game I thought had potential. I think by now the playtest is over, but wishlist it anyway if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching. Follow me on Twitch, on Twitter, subscribe, have a great day, and see you later.